The origin of the pact that would bind the destinies of Italy and Germany during the Second World War did not emerge overnight. It was woven step by step through personal ambitions, miscalculated admirations, and mistaken perceptions about each country's real capabilities. To understand how both regimes ended up so closely allied, one must return to the mid-1930s, when Benito Mussolini still saw himself as the master of European fascism and Adolf Hitler as an emerging radical politician seeking international legitimacy. Mussolini had been, in fact, a pioneer. He had been in power for more than a decade when Hitler made his definitive rise. The Duce had stabilized the fascist party, consolidated a one-party regime, repressed the opposition, and presented the world with an image of order, strength, and efficiency. Hitler watched him with a mixture of fascination and envy. In the private conversations of Nazi leaders, Mussolini was cited as an example of the modern leader who had achieved what the National Socialist movement still aspired to accomplish. The Führer saw him as an almost mythical model, a precursor who demonstrated that an entire nation could be redirected toward absolute discipline. However, that admiration was not reciprocated. Mussolini, in 1933, considered Hitler a dangerous amateur, too radical, too obsessed with racial questions, and lacking the political stature the Italian believed he himself possessed. The Nazi rise to power was viewed with suspicion in Rome, where there was fear that a strong Germany might destabilize the delicate balance of power in Europe, especially in Austria, which, since the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was regarded by Italy as a fundamental part of its sphere of influence. The assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss in 1934 by local Nazis raised all alarms. Mussolini mobilized troops toward the Brenner Pass and warned Hitler that Italy would not tolerate a German annexation of Austria. At that moment, it seemed the two leaders were destined to collide, not to unite, but time would profoundly change that dynamic. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 changed everything. Mussolini launched that colonial project to demonstrate the vitality of fascism and consolidate his internal leadership. The League of Nations condemned the aggression, and the democratic powers imposed economic sanctions on Italy. Mussolini felt betrayed by Britain and France, countries with which he had previously cooperated to contain Germany. Diplomatically isolated, the Duce began to look toward Berlin with new eyes. Hitler, aware of the opportunity, publicly supported the Italian invasion, condemned the sanctions, and showed himself willing to pursue closer cooperation. The rapprochement accelerated in 1936. Germany reoccupied the Rhineland without encountering resistance, proving that the Western democracies were not prepared to oppose it. Mussolini, impressed by the boldness of the Germans, began to imagine a Europe divided into two axes of power and pronounced for the first time the term Rome-Berlin axis. The expression suggested an alliance between equals, but from the outset it was clear that Germany was growing militarily and economically at a pace impossible for Italy to match. Even so, Italian propaganda portrayed it as a visionary pact between two great powers that would support one another in redrawing the map of the continent. The Spanish Civil War strengthened that bond. Mussolini sent thousands of soldiers from the Corpo Truppe Volontarie to support Francisco Franco, while Hitler dispatched the Condor Legion. The military cooperation revealed that Germany possessed a far superior war machine, with modern tanks, effective artillery, and an experienced Luftwaffe. Italy contributed numbers but not quality. Although Mussolini publicly praised the work of his volunteers, privately he observed with growing unease how the Wehrmacht acted with surgical precision, while his own forces suffered logistical delays and technical shortcomings. The balance within the Axis was beginning to tilt visibly. By 1938, the idea of a more formal alliance had become inevitable. Hitler carried out the Anschluss and annexed Austria without consulting Italy. Mussolini, who just 4 years earlier had been willing to mobilize his army to prevent it, accepted the annexation as a fait accompli. His change of position showed how much the correlation of forces had shifted. He was no longer in a position to set limits for Germany. It was Germany that set the pace and forced him to adapt. With the Sudetenland crisis, Hitler once again acted without permission, though he symbolically thanked Italy for its support during the Munich conference. In the photographs of the meeting, Mussolini appeared as an important figure, but everyone knew the initiative had been German from the start. On May 22, 1939, this rapprochement culminated in a historic agreement, the Pact of Steel. The document, signed by ministers Galeazzo Ciano and Joachim von Ribbentrop, promised total mutual assistance in the event of war, strategic coordination, and an indissoluble military alliance. For Hitler, the pact was a way to ensure that Italy would not interfere with his plans for expansion toward the east and that it would provide secondary support when necessary. For Mussolini, it was a way to avoid becoming isolated again and to guarantee that Italy would be recognized as a great power. But the expectations each leader had of his ally were completely different. Hitler hid his true intentions from Mussolini. The Führer was already preparing the invasion of Poland and envisioned a total war in Europe. He believed time was on his side as the German economy was mobilized and the Wehrmacht was reaching an impressive level of modernization. Italy, by contrast, was not prepared. Its war industry was weak, its supply of oil and raw materials insufficient, and its armed forces were equipped with largely obsolete weaponry. Mussolini had been informed that Italy would need at least 2 or 3 more years of preparation before being able to face a large-scale war. He ignored those warnings. The Duce also believed that Hitler would not start a major war before 1943. Galeazzo Ciano, his son-in-law and foreign minister, noted in his diary that Mussolini was convinced the Pact of Steel posed no immediate danger, as Nazi Germany was simply bluffing against France and Britain. That interpretation was a monumental error. Hitler had already decided that Europe would be conquered by force. When in August 1939 Germany signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact with the Soviet Union, Mussolini was completely bewildered. Not only had he not been consulted, but he discovered that his ally had negotiated with the nation that both regimes considered their ideological enemy. Hitler even ordered his diplomats not to inform Rome of the details until just a few hours before making it public. When Germany finally invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Mussolini found himself in an impossible position. Italy had signed a pact that committed it to enter the war, but it lacked the minimum weaponry, fuel, and logistics to do so. Privately, Mussolini confessed that Italy is not prepared spiritually or materially for war. Hitler, who calculated every move, knew perfectly well the fragility of Italy and did not demand its immediate intervention. What he wanted was to have his hands free in the east without fearing Italian interference, and in fact preferred that Italy enter the conflict only when Germany had secured its first victories. With the war already underway, Mussolini tried to maintain the fiction of a powerful and influential Italy within the Axis. His speeches spoke of an imperial destiny, fascist energy, and a new European order, but his generals knew that the country lacked the capacity to fulfill such ambitions. The relationship with Germany entered a second phase, no longer a diplomatic balance, but a deeply asymmetric alliance. From 1939 onward, Hitler's leadership would be dominant and Mussolini's dependent, and while Germany advanced through Poland with a level of efficiency that astonished the world, Italy remained in an uncomfortable limbo, trapped between the promise of the Pact of Steel and the practical impossibility of contributing to the war. That contradiction would explain much of what came next: improvisation, desperate decisions, and military cooperation marked by humiliating inequalities. Italy is not ready, the unprepared entry into the war 1940. When war broke out in September 1939, Italy was left in an ambiguous, almost contradictory position. The country had signed the Pact of Steel, which supposedly committed Italy to enter the conflict alongside Germany, but Mussolini knew that his army could not sustain a modern war. Even so, during the early months of the conflict, the Duce staged a posture of non-belligerence, which sought to preserve prestige before his ally while buying time to reorganize a war machine that had been lagging behind for years. In his speeches, he spoke of active neutrality, but in private, he acknowledged that Italian industry would not produce enough ammunition and weapons until 1943. It was a late admission of a reality that no one around him dared openly contradict. Mussolini's political calculations began to unravel as soon as the war started. The astonishing speed with which Germany defeated Poland, revealing the strength of the Wehrmacht, intimidated Rome. The Duce watched how the German blitzkrieg combined panzers, modern artillery, tactical aviation, and flawless logistical coordination. Italy, by comparison, seemed like an army from another era. Its divisions were still based on heavy infantry structures, slow and poorly equipped. Mechanized regiments consisted of a small number of armored vehicles, most of them light or outright inadequate for serious combat. The contrast with Germany was humiliating. Mussolini believed the war would be short, convinced that the British would not resist and that France would collapse within weeks. This optimistic view did not come from solid strategic analysis, but from political desire. Italy had to participate in the victory to secure a place in the future European order designed by Hitler. If the war ended before Italy intervened, the imperial ambitions of fascism would go unrewarded. The Duce did not want to be left out of the table where the continent would be divided. But every step he took pushed him into a more dangerous dilemma. His army lacked supplies, his oil reserves were minimal, barely enough for a few weeks of operations, and the navy lacked a modern radar system. The Regia Aeronautica, although prestigious for its exploits in the previous decade, was equipped with aircraft already inferior to both British and German models. In March 1940, Galeazzo Ciano wrote in his diary what many Italian generals whispered cautiously, "We are entering the war with a knife against a rifle." The reports Mussolini received from his technical advisors left no room for optimism. Italy had enough ammunition for only 2 or 3 months of sustained fighting. Factories lacked good quality steel. The military motor pool was so small that Italian divisions would march on foot while German troops moved on hundreds of thousands of Opel Blitz trucks. Despite this bleak panorama, the German victories on the Western Front accelerated the Duce's impatience. When Hitler invaded Norway and Denmark in April 1940, the image of an invincible Wehrmacht became even clearer. Mussolini, who often measured his personal prestige in comparison with Germany, felt compelled to act. The fall of France would be the turning point. In June 1940, the German offensive broke through the French defenses with astonishing speed. Paris was about to fall. The European political map was transforming before everyone's eyes, and Mussolini feared the war would end without Italy having participated. On 10th June 1940, the Duce made the decision that would determine the country's fate. He declared war on France and the United Kingdom from the balcony of Palazzo Venezia. He announced it to an exalted crowd, assuring them that Italy had waited too long and that the moment of fascist greatness had arrived. But behind the theatrical gesture there was no strategic planning. It was a political gamble, a move to ensure Italy appeared as a belligerent power at the exact moment Germany was about to obtain total victory on the continent. Mussolini believed France would collapse within hours, allowing Italy to claim territories in the Alps, Corsica, and perhaps even the French Riviera. In practice, Italy entered an already nearly decided war without having fought and without the material capacity to do so. The Italian army advanced timidly over the French Alps but encountered harsh weather, well-prepared defenses, and low morale among its own soldiers. Losses were significant, and the offensive produced only minor territorial gains. When the Franco-German armistice was signed a few days later, Italy had played only a symbolic role in France's defeat. The humiliation deepened when Hitler decided that the share of the spoils assigned to Italy would be minimal. Neither Corsica nor the French Riviera were handed over to Italian control. The Duce understood, too late, that his ally was the one drawing the map and that he could hope only for scraps. The imbalance in the relationship between the two regimes was now taking painfully concrete form. Italy was a second-tier partner within the Axis, and its late entry left it with no military credibility in German eyes. The initial enthusiasm among the Italian population faded quickly. The war would not be short. The United Kingdom, far from surrendering, resisted with determination and prepared for total defense. The British retained control of the Mediterranean, blocking Italian supply lines to North Africa. The structural weaknesses of the Italian economy became even more evident. Petrol rationing, shortages of aviation fuel, and difficulties transporting raw materials across a sea patrolled by the Royal Navy. Meanwhile, Italian generals tried to reorganize armed forces forced to fight in very different territories: the Alps, the Mediterranean, the Horn of Africa, and soon the Balkans. Strategic dispersion was obvious. Mussolini wanted to demonstrate power on multiple fronts, but Italy lacked the logistical capacity to wage a war of that magnitude. Planning was poor, coordination between the three branches of the military was almost non-existent, and communication with Berlin deteriorated as the Germans increasingly saw the Italians as a difficult, unpredictable, and inefficient ally. Hitler, although publicly maintaining a cordial personal relationship with Mussolini, considered Italy's late entry a reckless move. In private, he remarked that Mussolini had entered the war with a toy soldier army. The phrase, transmitted by several German diplomats, reflected the growing contempt Wehrmacht commanders felt toward the fascist forces. They knew the Duce had gambled on a quick victory without understanding the implications of a prolonged war. By late 1940, Italy found itself in a fragile position, declining morale, an economy on the brink of logistical collapse, and military units suffering constant operational difficulties. Mussolini insisted that Italy had to conquer its own imperial space, but his strategic decisions revealed improvisation. Unlike Germany, where military planning followed a clear structure, in Italy orders were based more on the Duce's personal impulses than on technical analysis. This difference explains why Italy would launch, just a few months later, an offensive in the Balkans without consulting Hitler, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for the credibility of the Italian army within the Axis. Cooperation and conflict in the Balkans, the campaigns in Greece and Yugoslavia. Italy's initial failure in its entry into the war did not stop Mussolini's ambition. On the contrary, it pushed him to seek a quick victory that would balance Italy's growing dependence on Germany. By late 1940, the Duce was eager to demonstrate that Italy was still a power capable of sustaining a decisive offensive on its own. His objective was clear: to conquer Greece. He did not consult Hitler, nor did he properly assess logistics or consider the mountainous terrain and harsh winter conditions of the Balkans. The campaign was planned in secret in just a few weeks, under a fantasy of tactical superiority that did not exist. The political motivation was evident. Mussolini was irritated by Germany's successes in Eastern Europe. The Anschluss, the occupation of Czechoslovakia, and the swift victory in France had elevated Hitler's prestige to levels that eclipsed the Duce. The Führer had become the true architect of the Axis, relegating Mussolini to a secondary role. In this atmosphere of jealousy and rivalry, the Italian leader decided that Italy had to conquer a European country without German help to prove its strategic autonomy. Greece appeared to be the ideal target, a small country with an allegedly inferior army and a territory whose conquest would offer prestige and geopolitical advantages in the eastern Mediterranean. On October 28, 1940, without prior notice to Berlin, Italy launched its offensive from Albania. Propaganda announced an inevitable victory and portrayed Greece as a minor obstacle. However, from the first days, reality imposed itself with brutal clarity. Italian forces were poorly equipped, with scarce heavy weaponry, few motorized vehicles, and incomplete divisions. Soldiers advanced on foot through flooded or non-existent roads with insufficient supplies and uniforms that failed to protect them from the cold, humid climate of the Epirus Mountains. Mules, still essential to Italian logistics, struggled on steep paths that had not even been properly scouted. The Greek army, by contrast, offered formidable resistance. It rapidly mobilized experienced mountain troops, reinforced key positions, and took advantage of its knowledge of the terrain. Greek morale was high. They were defending themselves from what they saw as an unjustified aggression, and they enjoyed broad popular support. Within weeks, the Italian offensive collapsed. What was meant to be a rapid advance became a disorderly retreat. The Greeks counterattacked with determination, pushing the Italians back into Albania and occupying several sectors of Italian-controlled territory. It was an unexpected humiliation for a regime that had promised limitless imperial expansion. The situation deteriorated so much that reports sent to Rome described frontline conditions as chaotic, communications cut, entire units isolated by snowstorms, commanders unaware of the location of their own troops, and Italian divisions trapped in a positional war for which they were unprepared. In the halls of power in Berlin, Hitler watched the disaster with incredulity. The Führer had repeatedly warned that Italy should not open new fronts without coordination. He now understood that the Italian blunder directly threatened his own plans in the Balkans. Italy's defeat in Greece had specific strategic implications for Germany. Hitler was preparing Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which required a secure rear in southeastern Europe. If Greece resisted and even received British support, the Eastern Mediterranean could become an entry point for the Royal Air Force and future British operations against the Romanian oil fields, essential for the German war machine. The Italian failure was not simply a humiliation for Mussolini, it was a serious risk to Germany's global strategy. Faced with this scenario, Hitler made a decision that would permanently shape relations between the two regimes. He ordered German intervention. The Wehrmacht entered the Balkans not to expand the Axis, but to rescue its partner. What had been Mussolini's attempt to reaffirm Italian autonomy became, for Germany, proof that the Duce was incapable of sustaining a war on his own. From then on, the German perception of the Italian army changed drastically. It was no longer a weak ally, but a liability that had to be managed. German intervention brought with it another unexpected problem: Yugoslavia. Pressured by Axis expansion, the country had signed a partial adhesion to the tripartite pact in March 1941. But just 2 days later, a coup in Belgrade overthrew the pro-Axis government. Hitler interpreted the coup as a betrayal and decided to invade Yugoslavia swiftly in order to secure the region before attacking Greece. The German plan now became a dual operation: crush Yugoslavia and then defeat Greece in a lightning campaign. The Blitzkrieg in the Balkans began on April 6, 1941. German forces advanced with extraordinary speed, combining armored units, paratroopers, and air support. In just 11 days, Yugoslavia capitulated. The country was dismantled and divided among the Axis powers, with areas controlled directly by Germany, Italy, Hungary, and the independent state of Croatia. The campaign demonstrated once again the enormous gap between German and Italian operational capacity. While the Wehrmacht advanced with mathematical precision, Italian forces acted as auxiliaries in regions facing lighter resistance. After securing Yugoslavia, Germany turned its offensive toward Greece. Within weeks, the resistance that had stopped and defeated the Italians collapsed under the combined weight of German tactics. Panzer divisions broke defensive lines that had held firm for months, paratroopers seized strategic points, and the Luftwaffe neutralized Greek air capabilities. The fall of Athens in April 1941 was a devastating blow. Mussolini attended the armistice signing in an attempt to preserve the appearance of co-authorship in the victory. But the reality was humiliating. Italy had failed in Greece, and Germany had been forced to take complete control of the region. Even in this unfavorable context, Mussolini tried to reclaim Italian prestige. He ordered the Italian flag to be raised alongside the German one on several administrative buildings in Athens, but German officers frequently relegated Italians to a secondary role in official ceremonies. Tensions between the two powers became increasingly visible. German military officials described Italian forces as undisciplined, poorly prepared, and incapable of modern planning. In Rome, Ciano wrote bitterly in his diary that German intervention had turned the Greek campaign into a painful demonstration of our weakness. The Balkan disaster not only damaged Italy's military reputation, but also created deep diplomatic friction. Hitler no longer trusted Mussolini's ability to control conquered territories. The Germans took control of mainland Greece, central Yugoslavia, and strategic points in the Aegean. Italy received some areas of administration, parts of the Dalmatian coast and sectors of Epirus, but these were symbolic concessions. Real authority in the Balkans was German. For Mussolini, this loss of prestige was a devastating personal blow. The Greek campaign, meant to demonstrate Italy's autonomy and military strength, ended by confirming its total dependence on its German ally. Fascist propaganda attempted to obscure the truth, presenting the victory as the result of joint action in which Italy had played a crucial role. But neither in Rome nor in Berlin was there any illusion. The facts made it clear that the Italian army lacked the capacity to undertake ambitious military operations without German supervision. The consequences extended far beyond 1941. Italian resentment over German intervention fueled tensions within the Axis that would prevent full cooperation, and the German perception of its allies as incompetent would shape military relations in other campaigns, especially in Africa. North Africa, from Italian ambition to German dominance. The Italian defeat in Greece had left Mussolini in a critical situation. His international prestige was at rock bottom, and internal confidence was crumbling. He desperately needed a victory to offset the humiliations suffered in the Balkans. The ideal stage for this imperial revival seemed to be North Africa, where Italy had already maintained a significant colonial presence for decades, Libya. From there, Mussolini envisioned a rapid expansion into Egypt, a territory controlled by the United Kingdom and vital for communications with the Middle East and the Suez Canal. Fascist propaganda spoke of a new Italian Mediterranean empire, a restored Mare Nostrum that would project fascist power across a strategically important region of the world. However, Mussolini's imperial dream clashed with the material reality of the Italian army. Although the Regia Marina had some modern units, its ability to operate in the Mediterranean was severely limited by British naval superiority and the lack of radar. The Regia Aeronautica was numerically significant, but suffered from a shortage of modern aircraft and aviation fuel. As for the ground forces, the situation was even more precarious. The divisions in Libya were poorly equipped, lacked sufficient vehicles, suffered from supply problems, and had minimal training for desert warfare. Despite these problems, in the fall of 1940, Mussolini pushed for a rapid offensive into Egypt. On September 13, 1940, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, the Italian commander in Africa, launched the invasion. Accompanying the attack was the repeated conviction from Rome that British forces were weak and poorly distributed. Although the Italians managed to advance about 100 kilometers into Egyptian territory, their progress was slow and hesitant. They constructed a series of defensive positions around Sidi Barrani, but did not continue toward the Suez Canal. The advance stalled because the Italian divisions could not sustain a prolonged offensive. They lacked transport, their light tanks were obsolete, and their supply lines were vulnerable. Graziani, aware of the danger, refused to advance further without reinforcements, which infuriated Mussolini. While Italy was bogged down in Egypt, the British prepared a counter-offensive. In December 1940, Operation Compass began under the command of General Richard O'Connor. What the British executed was not a limited operation, but a devastating attack that completely collapsed the Italian positions. In just 2 months, they captured Bardia, Tobruk, and much of Cyrenaica. Over 130,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner, along with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces. The scale of the disaster stunned all of Europe. It was the first major land defeat of the Axis in the war, and it was exclusively Italian. For Mussolini, it was a humiliating blow. In private conversations, the Duce reportedly said, "The Italians have lost an army like one loses a napkin." But the gravity was much greater. Without immediate German intervention, all of Italy's possessions in Africa would have fallen. Hitler, who had initially sought to avoid deep involvement in the Mediterranean theater, realized that Italy alone could not stop the British. If North Africa were completely lost, the Axis's strategic position in the Mediterranean would be destroyed. Thus was born the Africa Corps. In early 1941, Germany sent one of its boldest commanders, Erwin Rommel. His arrival transformed the course of the war in the desert. Rommel not only applied innovative tactics, but also demonstrated a personal energy that contrasted with the uncertainty and slowness of the Italian command. His leadership style, which included frontline inspections, rapid attacks, and risky maneuvers, among other daring actions, captivated his soldiers and bewildered the British. Within weeks, he recaptured most of Cyrenaica and even besieged Tobruk, a strategic point that would become a symbol of resistance for the Allies. As Rommel rose to legendary status, the Italians were effectively relegated to a secondary role. Although they still outnumbered the Germans in the African theater, it was clear that offensive capacity depended almost entirely on the Africa Corps. German officers viewed their allies with suspicion. Italian M13 and L3 tanks were vastly outmatched by British Crusader and Matilda tanks. Italian artillery was underpowered and suffered from a lack of adequate ammunition, and perhaps most critically, Italian logistics were chronically deficient. The ports of Tripoli and Benghazi could not receive enough supplies to sustain combined operations. Maritime convoys were constantly attacked by the Royal Navy and British aircraft based in Malta. Paradoxically, Rommel depended on these same Italian supplies. Every German tank, truck, and artillery piece had to cross the Mediterranean on Italian ships, escorted by a navy without radar and suffering significant defeats against the British. Despite this, the German Marshal maintained an increasingly negative view of Italian military capability. In letters and reports, Rommel claimed that the Italians lacked the offensive spirit necessary and that their military equipment was practically useless. Tensions within the Axis became increasingly visible. Rommel made decisions without consulting the Italian High Command, ignored their objections, and constantly pressured for more German divisions to be sent to the African front. Mussolini, desperate to maintain influence, ordered increased Italian participation, sending additional units such as the Ariete Division, composed of armored units, and the Folgore Division, composed of paratroopers. Some of these units showed remarkable valor, particularly the Folgore at El Alamein, but their individual sacrifices could not compensate for structural deficiencies. The Desert War, despite initial advances, began to become a labyrinth for the Axis. The distance between Tripoli and the Egyptian border exceeded 1,600 kilometers, an immense logistical challenge. Every liter of fuel sent from Italy could be consumed merely in transport to the front lines. While the British received constant support from Alexandria, Cairo, and Palestine, the Axis relied on an increasingly fragile lifeline. Germany needed to focus on the USSR. Italy, incapable of meeting its responsibilities, depended on German benevolence to sustain its ambitions. In 1942, after the offensive that brought the Afrika Korps to the gates of Alexandria, the German leadership seemed to have once again saved Italy from disaster. But the reality was different. The advance had exceeded the Axis's logistical capacity. The supply line was stretched to the maximum. Malta continued to strike convoys, and Allied reinforcements arrived at a pace Italy could never match. When the British, under Bernard Montgomery, launched their decisive counterattack in the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Axis began its final retreat. Italian positions collapsed first, followed by the Germans. By 1943, all of Libya had been lost. The North African campaign brutally revealed the true hierarchy within the Axis. Italy had entered the war with imperial dreams, imagining the conquest of Egypt and control of the eastern Mediterranean. But every significant advance was achieved by German troops, while retreats and operational collapses concentrated in Italian units. In the eyes of the world, and especially in Hitler's eyes, Italy had shifted from being a strategic partner to becoming an operational burden, a partner that had to be supervised, corrected, and at times replaced. The presence of the Afrika Korps in the desert, although celebrated by Italian propaganda, made clear that strategic initiative no longer belonged to Rome. Disaster and collapse, 1943, the fall of Mussolini, and the armistice with the Allies. At the beginning of 1943, Italy was entering a spiral of military, political, and moral disintegration that could no longer be hidden. The defeats in North Africa, the loss of Libya, logistical collapse, popular discontent, and economic exhaustion had turned the war into an unbearable burden for a country that had never been prepared for a prolonged conflict. The Italian army, victim of hasty political decisions, suffered increasing desertions, equipment shortages, and broken morale. What began as latent unrest would soon transform into a total collapse, dragging the fascist regime with it. The defeat in Tunisia in May 1943 marked a point of no return. More than 200,000 Axis soldiers surrendered there, including a significant proportion of Italian troops. The German presence, which in other theaters had acted as a stabilizing force, could not prevent the disaster. The Allies had regained the initiative in Africa and were now aiming directly at the heart of the Mediterranean. It was evident that once North Africa was secured, Sicily would be the next target. While Rommel informed Hitler about the impossibility of holding positions in Africa, Mussolini in Rome seemed disconnected from reality. His speeches continued to appeal to final victory, but his physical and mental health was deteriorating. Sick, fatigued, and increasingly isolated, the Duce was no longer the energetic leader of the 1930s. His ministers noted him as absent, erratic, and incapable of making clear decisions. Galeazzo Ciano recorded in his diary that Mussolini spent hours in silence, staring at maps he no longer had the strength to interpret. The crisis exploded definitively on July 10, 1943, when the Allies launched Operation Husky and landed in Sicily. The impact was immediate. Italian defenses, poorly organized and equipped with obsolete weapons, collapsed within days. Italian units retreated without significant resistance, leaving most of the fighting to German divisions sent urgently by Hitler. The German High Command watched with growing frustration as the Italian lines disintegrated, while the Wehrmacht assumed responsibility for slowing the Allied advance. Panic spread across Italy. In northern and central cities, Allied bombings caused hundreds of deaths. The civilian population, exhausted from years of rationing and poverty, demanded immediate peace. The Fascist Party was losing support even among its most loyal members. The Fascist National Guard could no longer control riots and strikes. Armament factories were paralyzed due to a lack of raw materials, and the black market had become the only way for millions to survive. In this critical context, the Grand Fascist Council decided to act for the first time in the entire history of the regime. On the night of July 24, 1943, in a tense and fear-laden meeting, the council members voted on a motion presented by Dino Grandi that essentially stripped Mussolini of direct control over military power and restored authority to King Victor Emmanuel III. It was a carefully calculated political betrayal. The fascist leaders themselves understood that the Duce could not save the country and that his continued command would only accelerate Italy's destruction. The following day, Mussolini was summoned to the royal palace. He believed the king would seek a military explanation or request him to reorganize the front. But what occurred became one of the most dramatic scenes of the war in Italy. Victor Emmanuel III, in a cold and distant tone, informed him that he was deposed. After 2 decades in power, the Duce heard the words that would seal his fall. "You have been replaced." Upon leaving the palace, he was arrested by the royal police and secretly transferred to various locations to prevent a possible German rescue. Mussolini's fall was met with widespread relief. Crowds took to the streets, tore down fascist symbols, and celebrated the end of the regime. However, the joy was mixed with uncertainty. The new head of government, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, announced that the war continues, a necessary lie to buy time while secret negotiations with the Allies took place. Badoglio knew that any public declaration of peace would immediately trigger a German invasion. Italy was trapped between 2 enemy forces, the Allies advancing from the south and the Germans already preparing to occupy the country preemptively. For weeks, a dangerous diplomatic game unfolded. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender. Badoglio tried to obtain better terms while attempting to reorganize defenses to prevent total collapse in case of a German reaction. Hitler, for his part, suspected that Italy was about to switch sides and ordered the deployment of several divisions to occupy strategic points in the country. The Wehrmacht began infiltrating troops disguised as reinforcements, silently preparing Operation Achse, the complete occupation of Italy in the event of betrayal. The armistice was signed on September 3, 1943 in Cassibile, but remained secret for several days. Finally, on September 8th, the Allies announced it publicly. What followed was absolute chaos. The Italian army, which had not been properly informed, was paralyzed. Entire units did not know whether to resist the Germans, surrender to the Allies, or attempt to retreat. Military commands were disoriented, and within hours the Wehrmacht executed Operation Achse with relentless precision. Germany occupied Rome, Milan, Turin, Florence, Bologna, and almost the entire peninsula in less than a week. Over 600,000 Italian soldiers were disarmed and sent to prisoner of war camps in Germany and Poland. Some regiments attempted to resist, but most collapsed under the rapid German advance. The Allies, surprised by the chaos, struggled to advance north. The country was divided, the south controlled by the Allies and the center north under total German occupation. Mussolini, meanwhile, remained detained in a location unknown even to most of the Italian government. For Hitler, the Duce's fall was not only a betrayal, but a direct threat to the Axis's stability. He decided to act immediately. He ordered a commando mission led by Otto Skorzeny to rescue Mussolini and reinstall him as the leader of a new fascist state under German control. The operation, spectacular from a propaganda standpoint, would become one of the most daring episodes of the war. Why was Italian armament so poor in World War II? The poor performance of the Italian army during World War II cannot be understood without a thorough examination of its equipment. From tanks and aircraft to rifles, artillery and vehicles, almost all Italian military material was either obsolete or poorly designed for the demands of modern conflict. The problem was not limited to a lack of technology. It was a deep combination of industrial backwardness, doctrinal errors, Shortages of strategic resources, administrative corruption, and political decisions that ignored warnings from the military itself. The result was an army entering the war armed as if it were 1918, not 1940. The starting point was the industrial base. Italy simply lacked the capacity to produce massive quantities of high-quality steel, powerful engines, modern armor, or advanced optical systems. Factories like Ansaldo, Fiat, and Breda operated with limited resources, outdated machinery, and fragmented production processes. While Germany worked with large integrated industrial complexes, Italy relied on small, scattered, and slow production centers. Shortages of coal, oil, and special alloys made it impossible to produce powerful engines and thick armor, which affected all military vehicles. Italian industry could design promising prototypes but could not produce them at scale. Thus, when war broke out, the country had insufficient reserves and no ability to quickly modernize existing equipment. Italian tanks were the most obvious symbol of this disadvantage. The most numerous armored vehicle was the L3/35 light tank, a tiny two-man tank that was, in practice, more a tankette than a real combat vehicle. Its maximum armor was only 14 millimeters, and its armament consisted of 2 machine guns, utterly useless against any enemy tank. These tanks were vulnerable even to anti-tank rifles or light artillery. During the first battles in the desert, many were destroyed by British vehicles with humiliating ease. Later models, such as the M11/39, M13/40, and M14/41, were only marginal improvements. They had 37mm or 47mm guns, but their design remained archaic. Weak engines frequently overheated. The armor was thin and riveted, which meant that when struck, rivets could dislodge and become deadly projectiles inside the tank for the crew. Although the P-26/40, a more modern tank comparable to the German Panzer III, appeared in 1942, it arrived too late and in laughably small numbers. Italy had lost all industrial initiative. Resources were primarily devoted to maintaining basic army logistics, not to modernizing weaponry. The Germans, desperate to improve their allies' performance, sent a few Panzer IVs and Sturmgeschütz, but in numbers insufficient to change the overall situation. Italian artillery faced similar problems. A considerable portion of the artillery in service came from World War I. Austro-Hungarian designed howitzers, small-caliber field guns, and outdated aiming systems. These weapons had shorter range and lower rate of fire compared to British, German, and Soviet counterparts. Ammunition shortages worsened the situation. In multiple campaigns such as Greece, Africa, and Russia, Italian officers reported having only a fraction of the ammunition necessary for sustained combat. Shells were of uneven quality, and propellant charges were sometimes so degraded that accuracy and range suffered. Individual weaponry was also uncompetitive. The standard rifle, the Carcano M91, was reliable but outdated, with a slower reloading system than the British Lee-Enfield. The Beretta M38 submachine guns were excellent weapons, but produced in quantities too small to equip all units that needed them. The Breda M30 machine guns, used in large numbers, were notorious for fragility and a tendency to jam. They required constant lubrication, a fatal requirement in climates like the African desert or the mountains of Greece. Radio equipment was scarce and heavy. Many Italian units entered combat without proper communications, making it almost impossible to coordinate offensive maneuvers or call in artillery support on time. The Regia Aeronautica, which had been at the forefront in the 1930s, entered the war with aircraft that were no longer up to the task. Italy had agile and maneuverable designs, such as the Macchi C-200 and C-202, excellent in dogfights, but with engines too weak to provide speeds or climb rates comparable to British or German fighters. The Savoia Marchetti SM-79 bombers were reliable but slow, vulnerable to enemy fighters, and limited in payload. Most Italian aircraft lacked pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, features considered essential by the major powers. Furthermore, the Italian aeronautical industry could not produce powerful engines. While Germany used Daimler-Benz engines of 1,300 to 1,500 horsepower, Italy worked with engines of 800 to 900 horsepower at best. Fuel shortages further limited air capabilities. Italy had no domestic oil and relied on imports vulnerable to the British blockade. Many pilots received minimal training to conserve fuel. a situation that degraded the quality of air personnel. The same applied to the army's motorized vehicles. Most Italian divisions were not mechanized. Soldiers marched on foot, and transportation relied on mules, old trucks, and a few imported vehicles. While the Germans moved entire divisions with motorized efficiency, Italy advanced slowly, allowing the enemy to choose where to strike. Other deep factors explained the precariousness of Italian armament. Fascist military doctrine remained anchored in World War I ideas: large infantry, frontal attacks, little attention to mechanized warfare. Even when young commanders warned that the future belonged to tanks and tactical aviation, regime politics prioritized propaganda over technical modernization. Mussolini preferred investing in grand parades, monumental works, or colonial projects rather than modern arms factories. The bureaucratic system itself was plagued by corruption and favoritism, which harmed the quality of material delivered to the troops. The contrast with Germany increased the perception of inferiority. Italian soldiers in Africa, the Balkans, or Russia saw German equipment up close: better armored tanks, more effective guns, numerous trucks, modern radios, and faster aircraft. The difference not only affected battle outcomes but also morale. Many Italian officers wrote that their men felt abandoned by their own state, sent into combat with tools insufficient to survive in an industrialized conflict. The German reaction: occupation of Italy and rescue operation. The fall of Mussolini in July 1943 not only shocked Italy, it struck directly at the heart of German strategy in the Mediterranean. For Hitler, the removal of the Duce was not a simple change of leadership. It was an unexpected blow that could trigger the collapse of the Axis on its southern flank. The swift actions of the Italian monarchy, followed by the establishment of Marshal Badoglio's government, immediately raised German suspicions. Hitler understood that Italy was on the verge of leaving the war, signing an armistice with the Allies, and allowing them to use the peninsula as a platform to invade Austria and southern Germany. This was a threat too great to leave in Italian hands. From the very beginning, Hitler reacted with a mix of personal fury and military calculation. In his view, the betrayal did not come only from the Italian state, but also from King Victor Emmanuel III. German intelligence indicated that the new leadership was negotiating with the Allies even before Mussolini had been officially removed. Hitler ordered the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht to prepare an emergency plan that had been considered months earlier: Operation Achse. This plan involved the immediate occupation of Italy in case of surrender, the forced demobilization of the Italian army, and direct German control of the peninsula. Operation Achse was prepared in absolute secrecy. From July 1943, German divisions disguised as reinforcements began quietly entering Italy. German officers infiltrated key military offices and ministries. The objective was clear: when the moment arrived, Italy had to be taken by surprise, leaving no chance for organized resistance. Meanwhile, Hitler did not abandon his symbolic intention of restoring Mussolini as head of state. To maintain Axis political cohesion, the Führer needed the Duce, even if only as a decorative figure under German control. After his arrest, Mussolini was moved to several secret locations: first Ponza, then La Maddalena, and finally the remote Hotel Campo Imperatore in the Gran Sasso Massif, a natural fortress impossible to reach by land without detection. His isolation had a clear goal: to prevent any German intervention. However, Hitler was determined to rescue him. For the Führer, the fall of the Duce was an extremely dangerous symbol, showing that a fascist regime could be toppled from within. He feared that this example would inspire opponents in other Allied countries or even within Germany. The rescue operation was entrusted to a man whose reputation was already growing within the SS, Otto Skorzeny. Tall, ambitious, and an expert in special operations, Skorzeny was personally selected by Hitler after a meeting where several officers presented possible plans. The Führer needed a spectacular action that would reinforce confidence within the Axis and send a clear message to the world. Germany would not abandon its allies even when they had been removed by their own leadership. Thus was born Operation Oak, or Unternehmen Eiche in German, a mission that combined military audacity with propagandistic theater. On September 12, 1943, 11 DFS 230 gliders, piloted by German paratroopers, landed almost simultaneously on the Gran Sasso Plateau, just a few meters from the hotel where Mussolini was held. It was an extremely risky landing as the terrain was uneven and a gust of wind could have crashed the gliders against the rocks. One glider was seriously damaged, but most managed to land near the target. The Italian guards, surprised by the speed of the operation and without clear orders to resist, surrendered without firing a single shot. Scorzeni stormed the hotel and found the Duce isolated, but aware of the historical magnitude of his situation. The image of Mussolini being escorted to a small Fieseler Storch plane, which landed and took off from the narrow Gran Sasso platform, would become one of the Third Reich's propagandistic icons. The rescue was presented as irrefutable proof of Germany's ability to act decisively where others hesitated. Hitler was delighted. Although the operation was actually the work of General Kurt Student's paratroopers, Scorzeni capitalized on the glory. From then on, he would be known as the most dangerous man in Europe. With Mussolini safely in Germany, Hitler proceeded with the second part of his plan, the total occupation of Italy. On September 8th, when the armistice signed at Casabile was publicly announced, chaos erupted. Italian officers had not received clear instructions. Many soldiers thought the war was over, while others believed they had to fight the Germans. In this climate of absolute confusion, the Wehrmacht acted with relentless efficiency. They disarmed Italian units within hours. In Rome, after brief skirmishes, they took control of the city. In the Balkans, more than 250,000 Italian soldiers were quickly captured. The Germans not only occupied the peninsula but also seized Italian military equipment, including artillery, vehicles and aircraft. German behavior during the occupation was brutal from day one. They considered the Italians not as former allies, but as traitors. Thousands of Italian soldiers were deported to labor camps in Germany and Poland, where they were not treated as prisoners of war, but as Italian military internees, a particularly harsh category that allowed the denial of basic rights under the Geneva Convention. Many died of hunger, disease, or exhaustion in miserable conditions. At the same time, Hitler ordered the execution of Italian officers who offered significant resistance. However, German military control alone was insufficient to give political legitimacy to the new order in Italy. Hitler needed to reinstall Mussolini, not only as a symbolic trophy but as a political tool. The Duce, rescued and physically and emotionally weakened, was taken to northern Italy to lead a new regime, the Italian Social Republic, or RSE-1. It was a puppet state entirely sustained by German bayonets. The capital would be Salò, a small town on the shores of Lake Garda. From there, Mussolini would govern a seemingly reborn fascist Italy. In reality, he had no autonomy. Germany controlled the army, the economy, the police, and internal security. While the Germans consolidated their control in central and northern Italy, the Allies advanced slowly from the south. The country was divided along two lines: the German-occupied zone, under the facade of the RSI, and the area controlled by the legitimate government of the King and Badoglio, now allied with the British and Americans. This division turned Italy into a fragmented battlefield where German forces, Italian partisans, RSI troops, and the Allies waged a simultaneous, complex, and bloody war. The Italian Social Republic, RS-1, the Salo Puppet. When Mussolini was rescued by German commandos and moved to Germany, many believed that the Duce would return with renewed leadership. In reality, what began in September 1943 was not a revival but an artificial resurrection. Hitler needed Mussolini, but not as an ally. He needed him as a decorative figure to legitimize the German occupation of northern and central Italy. Thus was born the Italian Social Republic, also known as the Republic of Salò, a fascist state reconstructed on the ruins of the original regime, but entirely subordinate to the Third Reich. The Duce arrived at Lake Garda weakened, aged, and emotionally shattered. The days of imprisonment following his removal, combined with the surprise of the rescue, had undermined his health. According to German witnesses and members of his inner circle, Mussolini seemed a shadow of himself. He spoke in a weak voice, fatigued quickly, and showed lapses in concentration. Still, Hitler urged him to return to power not out of affection, but because he needed an Italian political facade. A territory governed directly by Germany would have provoked greater civil resistance. A new fascist state, on the other hand, could absorb part of the social pressure and compel Italians to fight against their own compatriots. The RSI was officially founded on September 23, 1943. Its administrative headquarters was established in Salo, a small and isolated town chosen precisely because it was easy to control. Mussolini proclaimed that fascism was regaining its original purity, free from monarchical influence and the conservative compromises that, in his view, had weakened the regime. He spoke of a return to the revolutionary, social and radical fascism of the 1920s. But all of this was rhetoric. In reality, every ministry, every military decision and every police operation was under German supervision. True power rested with the Wehrmacht, the SS and the plenipotentiaries sent by Hitler. One of the pillars of the new republic was the creation of its own army, the Republican National Army, or ENR. However, its formation faced enormous difficulties. Italy was exhausted. Many soldiers preferred to desert or join the partisans rather than serve a regime they considered illegitimate. The units that were formed were poorly equipped, with weapons taken from former royal regiments or supplied by the Germans in minimal quantities. Fascist officers hoped to create disciplined divisions, but in practice they were able to raise only a few reliable units. Among them, the famous San Marco Division and the Monterosa Division, trained directly by German instructors. Even with German training, these units never reached the combat effectiveness of the Wehrmacht. Many recruits were inexperienced youths or demotivated veterans. Most fought more out of obligation or fear of reprisals than loyalty to fascism. Some, aware that the war was lost, only sought to survive long enough to avoid falling into German hands as deserters or being executed by RSI tribunals. Mussolini tried to dignify the Republican army with fiery speeches, but the reality on the front was bleak. The RSI was militarily dependent on Germany in every aspect. In parallel, the fascist secret police was reorganized as the Black Brigade, a paramilitary force intended to crush internal resistance. Their actions were particularly brutal. They expropriated property, executed civilians suspected of collaborating with partisans, and participated in mass raids. Under SS supervision, repression in northern Italy reached levels never seen under the previous regime. The RSI became an instrument of German terror, used to keep a population increasingly inclined toward armed resistance under control. This repressive environment worsened with the systematic deportation of Italian Jews. Unlike the pre-1943 fascist regime, which had applied discriminatory racial laws but with some moderation compared to Germany, the RSI fully adopted the Third Reich's genocidal policy. Thousands of Jews were arrested by fascist forces and handed directly to the Germans for deportation to Auschwitz and other extermination camps. It was a policy Mussolini could not stop, although some testimonies suggest he understood the gravity of what was happening. Mussolini's relationship with Hitler during the Salo era was radically different from the past. There were no longer meetings between equals, there were no strategic debates or diplomatic suggestions. Hitler received him at his headquarters as he would a subordinate. Mussolini took notes, nodded, and left. According to attendees, the meetings were quick, somber, and devoid of any illusion of reciprocity. Hitler spoke to him of resistance to the last man, final sacrifice, and a new Europe reborn after the storm. It was all empty propaganda. Germany was losing the war, and Mussolini knew it. The RSI was a sinking ship, sustained by foreign soldiers whose priority was not to protect Italy, but to defend the German retreat toward the Alps. In this climate of desperation, Italian fascism became more radical than ever. The leaders who had supported Mussolini's fall in 1943 were arrested and subjected to a show trial in Verona. The tribunal, completely dominated by the Germans, sentenced several former regime members to death, including Mussolini's own son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano. Ciano's execution marked a point of no return. Mussolini, forced to sign the sentence, was emotionally devastated. It confirmed that he no longer ruled even in his own state and that he was trapped between his past and the German machinery that sustained him. The RSI lived under a double war, against the Allies advancing from the south and against partisans who controlled the mountains and forests of the north. Every city, every town was divided among collaborators, fascist sympathizers, communist resistance, monarchists, Catholics, and ordinary citizens trying to survive in the chaos. Reprisals, sabotage, executions, and collective punishments turned Italy into a civil war within a larger war. By 1944 and 1945, the Republic of Salo existed only in name. The administration was collapsing, the economy destroyed, and partisans controlled increasing amounts of territory. The Germans were retreating northward, establishing increasingly improvised defensive lines. Mussolini, exhausted and aware of the end, seemed like a defeated leader even before the regime's actual fall. His final speeches revealed resignation, a bitter acceptance of failure, Italian resistance and civil war within the war. When the Italian Social Republic began functioning as a puppet regime under German tutelage, Italy entered one of the most complex, violent, and morally harrowing periods of its entire contemporary history. From late 1943 until the spring of 1945, the country ceased to be merely a battlefield between the Axis and the Allies and became the scene of a true civil war. Italians against Italians, partisans against fascists, monarchists against republicans, Catholics against communists, civilians caught between two simultaneous forms of violence, the German occupation and Salo's repression. In this context, the Italian resistance was forged, a diverse movement that challenged both the invaders and the rebuilt fascist state. The origin of the resistance was spontaneous. When the armistice of September 8, 1943 was announced and the Wehrmacht occupied the peninsula, thousands of Italian soldiers found themselves without clear orders. Many were captured immediately, but others, especially those who fled to the mountains or sought refuge in rural areas, began to organize. Initially, there was no formal structure. They were dispersed, improvised groups armed with old rifles or weapons abandoned by retreating units. However, the brutality of the German occupation and the repression of the RSI accelerated their formation. Within a few months, resistance cells emerged across all northern regions, in the Apennines, in the Veneto area, in Piedmont, in Lombardy, and in Emilia-Romagna. Some groups were driven by communist militants, others by monarchists loyal to King Victor Emmanuel III, others by moderate Catholics influenced by local clergy, and still others by ordinary citizens who had lost family members to Nazi-fascist repression. Paradoxically, this political diversity would become one of the movement's strengths, though it also generated internal tensions over the country's political future once the war ended. The resistance operated in multiple ways: sabotage of railway lines, blowing up bridges, ambushing German convoys, transmitting intelligence to the Allies, rescuing downed pilots, hiding persecuted Jews, and direct attacks on fascist detachments. Italy's geography, full of hills, narrow valleys, and dense forests, facilitated the formation of hard-to-access zones where RSI and Wehrmacht forces struggled to operate. There, partisans found refuge, though always under the threat of German reprisals that made no distinction between fighters and civilians. The German response was fierce. Specialized counterinsurgency units, such as SAS divisions and certain military police battalions, used ruthless methods: mass shootings, execution of hostages, burning entire villages, and deportations to concentration camps. One of the most emblematic episodes was the Ardeatine Caves massacre in March 1944, when 335 civilians and prisoners were executed in retaliation for a partisan attack in Rome. This was only one of hundreds of crimes committed by occupying forces in Italy. The RSI actively collaborated with these policies. The Black Brigades and the Republican National Guard carried out arrests, torture, and interrogations. Their repression was even fiercer than that of the original fascism, driven by resentment and the belief that only through force could a regime that had lost all social legitimacy be maintained. The prisons of Verona, Milan, and Turin were filled with suspects, many of them civilians with no real connection to the resistance. In numerous cities, the population lived in fear of both German raids and fascist reprisals. Faced with this situation, the resistance began coordinating its activities. In 1944, the National Liberation Committee, or CLN, was created, a clandestine political structure composed of representatives from the Communist, Socialist, Christian Democrat, Liberal, and Monarchist parties. Although these factions differed profoundly in their vision for Italy's future, they managed to agree on common objectives: expel the Germans, overthrow the RS-1, and restore a national government. The CLN also established contact with the Allies, who began sending weapons, equipment, and military advisors to strengthen the partisan movement in the north. The Italian Civil War acquired a dual-front dynamic. In the south, the Allies advanced slowly, facing fierce German resistance along defensive lines such as the Gustav Line, the Gothic Line, and other fortifications. In the center and north, partisans constantly harassed Axis forces. The civilian population was caught in between. In many regions, daily life became a struggle for mere survival. Food shortages, black markets, Allied bombings of industrial cities, German reprisals for partisan attacks, and fascist persecution to maintain internal order. Despite the difficulties, the resistance gained strength in 1944 and 1945. Germany's growing weakness and the internal collapse of the RSI encouraged thousands of young people to join the movement. Winter, however, hampered operations. But as soon as the spring of 1945 began to clear the mountain passes, the partisans launched a general offensive. It was a coordinated uprising that coincided with the Allies' final offensive in the Po Valley. Cities such as Milan, Turin, Genoa, and Bologna were partially liberated by partisan forces before the arrival of Anglo-American troops. This climax of the resistance not only represented the military defeat of the fascists, but also the moral collapse of the RSI. In its final days, loyalty to the regime almost completely disappeared. Officers deserted, militiamen tried to escape in disguise or negotiated local surrenders. Mussolini himself, aware that defeat was imminent, abandoned Salo and attempted to flee toward the Swiss border, accompanied by a small group of loyalists. His final route tragically and symbolically coincided with the area of greatest partisan activity. The Italian Civil War left deep scars. Fratricidal violence, betrayals, summary executions, and daily terror created a legacy of resentment and bitter memory that lasted for decades. In just 2 years, Italy had gone from a united dictatorship to a country divided between occupation, resistance, and collaboration. Salafascism became a historical warning of how far a regime can degenerate when it loses legitimacy and is sustained solely by foreign forces. With the liberation of northern Italy and the fall of the RSI, the Axis began its final disintegration. What happened next would mark the end of both Mussolini and the totalitarian project that had promised an empire and ended in ruins. The collapse of the Axis, German defeat, and the implosion of Italian fascism. By early 1945, the Axis structure in Europe was collapsing. Germany was retreating on all fronts, its lines breaking under the combined pressure of the Red Army in the east and Anglo-American forces in the west. In Italy, the Wehrmacht clung to the Gothic line, a chain of defences built across the Apennines but could barely hold it. The Italian Social Republic survived solely thanks to German military support. Without it, the Salo regime would have evaporated immediately. The final weeks before the end were a mix of desperate resistance, internal fragmentation, and accelerated moral collapse. On the northern front, German divisions were exhausted. Casualties were immense, replacements minimal, and logistical reserves almost non-existent. Roads were destroyed by Allied bombings, bridges blown up by partisans, and supplies barely sufficient to keep soldiers alive. RSI units meant to act as auxiliaries suffered massive desertions. Many Black Brigade militiamen abandoned their posts. ENR troops attempted to follow German orders, but their real capacity was minimal. Unlike in 1940, when propaganda promised a Mediterranean empire, the combatants of 1945 were only trying to survive. In Germany, Hitler ordered resistance to the last man, an absurd directive applied in Italy as well. Northern cities such as Bologna, Verona, Genoa, Milan, and Turin suffered constant bombings. Industries were paralyzed. The population survived thanks to the black market or clandestine aid from the partisans. The political climate in these regions was explosive. Spontaneous strikes, protests against the RSI, sabotage of militarized factories, and urban battles between fascist groups and insurgents. The control that the RSI had tried to impose through repression crumbled in the face of evidence that the war was lost. Meanwhile, Mussolini was trapped in Salo, surrounded by an ever-shrinking circle of collaborators. The figure who had once embodied energy, imperial ambition, and incendiary oratory was now aged and dejected. Witnesses of those months describe a weary leader, aware of his political ruin and of the growing contempt of his own supporters. Ministerial meetings were brief, somber, and devoid of enthusiasm. Every day brought news of lost cities, encircled German columns, and dissolved fascist units. Mussolini still held meetings with German generals, but he no longer had real influence. Heinrich Himmler and Karl Wolff controlled security affairs in the north. From Berlin, Hitler sent increasingly disconnected messages about the military reality. He spoke of miracle weapons, decisive counterattacks, and non-existent strategic strikes. The Duce, who once would have boasted of absolute loyalty to the Führer, now listened to these speeches with indifference. In private, he admitted that the war was lost and that Italy had been dragged into a conflict it could never win. The Axis implosion accelerated in April 1945. On April 9th, the Allies launched their final offensive in the Po Valley. The Germans, unable to resist, began a chaotic retreat northward. Italian RSI troops, outnumbered and without logistical support, disintegrated. Within a few weeks, Bologna fell, followed by Genoa, Turin, and finally Milan. In most of these cities, partisans seized control even before the Allies arrived. It was a widespread uprising, barricades in the streets, attacks on fascist barracks, summary executions of officials attempting to escape. Mussolini's situation became desperate. By late April, he realized that if he remained in Salo, he risked being captured by partisans or by RSI forces that no longer obeyed him. He decided to flee towards Switzerland, hoping to cross the border and possibly negotiate exile. He traveled in disguise, accompanied by his lover, Claretta Petacci, and a small group of loyalists. He attempted to hide within a retreating German column, trusting that the presence of Wehrmacht soldiers would allow him to traverse the last kilometers northward. But the partisan advance was relentless. On April 27, 1945, in the town of Dongo, a group of insurgents intercepted the German convoy and discovered Mussolini hiding. They immediately identified him. The fall of the Duce was swift, without resistance, without a final speech, without political theatre. The following day, he and Claretta Petacci were executed by order of the Liberation Committee. Their bodies were transported to Milan and hung upside down in Piazza Loreto, a brutal act intended to symbolize the definitive end of Italian fascism, ironically recalling Mussolini's earlier display of bodies in the same place years before. With the death of the Duce, the Salo regime collapsed completely. The last remnants of the RSI disintegrated or were captured by partisans and Allied troops. The Wehrmacht in Italy, without the possibility of retreat to Austria and lacking sufficient forces to continue resistance, signed the surrender on May 2, 1945, just days before Germany's total capitulation. The end of the war left Italy devastated. Over 500,000 dead, cities in ruins, a destroyed economy, displaced populations, and a society scarred by 2 years of civil war. The internal conflict between fascists and partisans left political wounds that would endure for generations. At the same time, the country had to rebuild its national identity after 2 decades of dictatorship. The collapse of the Axis not only meant the military defeat of Germany and Italy, but also the end of a political project that had promised order, grandeur, and power, but ended in destruction, humiliation, and total dependency. The ruins of Italian fascism and the German occupation demonstrated that the country had never been prepared for the war Mussolini aspired to wage.